My article is The Idea and Ideal of Reciprocity. I'm from the University of Arizona, and I'm in the Student Affairs Research Program for the summer of 2013. So my research question is quite simply, what are the effects of the indigenous economic mechanism of reciprocity on capitalism? So it's a very broad question, but for a very good reason. My goal for this question is to show how indigenous economic theories can be used to benefit a capitalist system, or how they can be used to replace a capitalist system to achieve better results. The reason I would like to do this is to show justification for indigenous people to rely on their traditional economic theories. Now, how do I go about answering that question? Obviously, it's very confusing, and I was very confused trying to do it. So after a few lonely nights, I came up with this. I'm going to use analytical philosophy. That is, I'm going to do a textual analysis of the relevant literature. So what is the relevant literature? Obviously, I'm talking about indigenous economic theories. I'm talking about capitalism. Other stuff I talk about in the paper, but I won't here today. I'll be talking about sociology, biology, more stuff like that. But for purposes of today, what I wanted to do is show you an example of how this works. So, to begin, these are some of the terms I'll be defining, not here today, but just in general. What is indigenous economic theory, reciprocity, etc. And what that means when I say I'll be defining them is I'll be taking the historical, psychological assumptions that people associate with these terms and trying to remove them, trying to distill the true meaning of these terms so that we can get down to what they actually represent, what they really mean, without all the banter, without all the talking heads, and etc. So, to begin, example, there's indigenous economic theory. It uses a mechanism of reciprocity to achieve sustainability, resiliency, social cohesion. Capitalism, what I want to do is use that same mechanism from indigenous economic theories and apply it to capitalism. Capitalism generally is used to achieve efficiency and profit. So, how indigenous economics would use reciprocity is through a system of potlatch. This is an example of the Northwest Coast tribe Nisga'a using that. And a potlatch is really just a giveaway ceremony. They have them for different reasons, whether it be a wedding, a new chief coming into power, or any reason to have a ceremony. There's a potlatch, and it's just a giant giveaway where you take all of your wealth, for the most part, and you give it away. And this is actually used as a mechanism to achieve those three things: sustainability, resiliency, and social cohesion. I don't think I have time to go into how all that works, but trust me. Capitalism. So capitalism involves extensive property rights. I went over this in my literature review. So extensive property rights and hierarchical firms. Now, extensive property rights, usually in capitalism, is referred to as a bundle of rights. And those bundle of rights are these down here. It's the right to use, to exclude, to income, to modify, to manage, to transfer, and to compensation and immunity from expropriation. Those last two are very important because they directly conflict with the indigenous economic idea of property ownership. One thing I should have mentioned back here actually is the way they achieve social cohesion is if someone is not producing efficiently, if they're not producing sustainably and in a way that is resilient for not just their community but the ecological community, they can be removed by either their constituents or by the other leaders, and without any recompense for that. They can just be exiled. And obviously, because of that, they can't just transfer their funds to anyone, because also to become into power, you have to show that knowledge, that you can use this resource sustainably, that you can use it in a manner that creates resiliency. So those two parts right there directly conflict with that. So we have an initial problem. So we can't just look at extensive property rights, but property rights in capitalism are reinforced by the idea of an efficient market. So, okay, so I just talked about. So the efficient market is best summarized by the Coase theorem, which simply says if there are no transaction costs, then private property owners will be able to reach a mutually beneficial agreement dealing with externalities without government interference. That is how capitalism usually would defend private property rights. Now, interesting about the Coase theorem is he never actually said that. It's what the Chicago School really read from his paper, The Problem of Social Cost, in 1960. But that's usually the justification used. Now, within that, the Chicago School usually defines that as being dealing only with capital, only with profit. So the problem with that is anytime you have an agreement between two people that are the people trying to reach an agreement, the person with the most money is always going to win. That's kind of implicit in what the Chicago School promotes. So that really can't work with indigenous peoples because oftentimes they have a connection to their land that goes beyond monetary value. So when you're trying to deal with externalities, you're saying, well, I'm just going to give you money and you can leave. That doesn't work. That doesn't fly. So let's move along. Hierarchical firms, that's the last part. So how does that work? That actually does work because a hierarchical firm is simply a master-servant relationship. The leaders lead, the followers follow, everyone falls in line, it works nicely, and that is within both firms. Obviously, there are caveats between the two, but the important thing is in the ideal of capitalism, there's nothing exploitative about this relationship. So I know Marx would say, well, it's a very exploitative relationship. It's master-servant. The servants are just being exploited and they're losing money. They're not getting properly compensated. But in the ideal of capitalism, there's nothing that would suggest that. It is simply free entry and exit into that firm. So if you feel like you're not making enough money, you're free to exit and find another firm. If you feel your employers are not, or your employees are not doing a good job, you can fire them. It's free entry, free exit. So when this relationship does work successfully, it is reciprocal. You give me money, I give you work, everyone's happy, and it's a nice example of teamwork. So now earlier I said the things capitalism is concerned with are efficiency and profit. Now efficiency, described in the Coase theorem, had to do with monetary costs, but it also had to do with relationships between firms, whereas profit is more concerned with the interests of the individual firm. So efficiency, like I said, is in terms of monetary costs, but what is profit? Profit does not necessarily have to be in terms of maximizing monetary means or maximizing capital. Capitalism is really just the acquisition of capital. Once you have that capital, you are not required to turn that into profit. Let's say I just want to get a bunch of bubble wrap. I buy all the bubble wrap in the world. What am I going to do with it? I'm going to sit around and pop it because I like bubble wrap. I'm not going to sell it for a profit. So there's nothing in capitalism inherently that says I have to turn that into a profit. So according to Gauss, and this is actually one of the biggest justifications for capitalism that people use, is that it is socially useful. That is not only socially useful, but it benefits all parties in the exchange. So let's go back to this previous definition of the Coase theorem. And we see that in bold, mutually beneficial agreements. Now, if you rely on the Chicago School of Thought and say that this has to be in terms of money, like I said earlier, then you get an exchange that cannot be mutually beneficial because the person with the most money is always going to win. And that's not always the right thing. It's not always the just conclusion. So how can you have a mutually beneficial agreement that is predicated on capital? You cannot. So capitalism, in that sense, ought to rely on a mechanism that produces mutual respect and teamwork. The idea of mutual respect comes from a mutually beneficial agreement. Why would I have a mutually beneficial agreement with you? Well, the only reason would be if I have some sort of mutual respect with you, because I'm not trying to screw you over, obviously. So that does imply mutual respect. So that's how we get that. Capitalism ought to rely on a mechanism that produces mutual respect and teamwork. Therefore, capitalism ought to rely on values of reciprocity, not on values of individual selfishness. And then there's a lot of other stuff that goes into that, but then I also provide empirical data showing that that works, not only in resource accumulation, but also in wage labor markets. And then at the end of the Coase's paper, The Problem of Social Cost, he calls for a change of approach, and I do resolve that in a way using reciprocity as opposed to using selfish behavior. The most important part, acknowledgements. Lots of people, good people. Questions? So yeah, I'm sorry that was very abbreviated, but yeah.
I could follow most of it, but I feel like in a perfect world you should have like an hour to explain everything you just explained.
Yeah, I would like a few hours.
And I don't know if there's anything that you can do to change this. Probably not, because we have like 15 minutes for presentation.
All right, for the presentation, I wasn't actually planning on going over all of this. I was just going to make my claims, and if people have questions, they can contact me, because there's no way I could fit that in.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Have you thought about maybe doing some kind of diagram, like mapping, or something like that with the relationship between Coase theory and indigenous.
Oh, just
marketing
like a table
theories,
showing how they
like that,
connect?
Just the relationships between the different theories or how you built them. That kind of thing.
Yeah, I'm really bad at that stuff.
A visual may help certain
Yeah.
people in the audience.
In my paper, I do have some graphs just showing, because I have a lot of empirical data backing all of this up. So from that, I do have graphs and charts.
I mean, you explained it really well. It's just that you start to forget stuff from before.
Mm-hmm.
So if you just list out like the way you explain,
Mm-hmm.
and then even just draw like arrows leading like on, and maybe have that on each slide or something, so people can stay with you.
Right.
That might make it easier.
Okay.
I think that's actually a good idea.
Mhm.
I think you're very, go back and forth.
Yeah.
So it's not very linear,
Yeah.
which is fine. And I think your audience is going to respond better to some sort of linear A to B presentation. So my advice would be to outline it at the beginning. This is what I'm going to cover. And then just follow it one right after the other. You knock down your points one at a time. And you can even go back and review your outline as you're going through it. But I think if you can present it in that type of linear fashion, where we can actually follow your thinking or your narrative that you're creating, I think that'll be a lot easier for your audience.
No,